So I hope you're all here to learn about the future of web applications. Yes, which is secretly also just the What's New in Angular talk, where I'm going to cover kind of all of the things that are going on in Angular in terms of how the framework's changing and how it's trying to do better and better for web developers. So in order for us to really understand the future of scalable web applications, I'm going to listen to this train. And then I'm going to go backwards in time. And I want to just give a brief story connecting to the GDG. So I've been interested in Angular for a long time, and I've been interested in Google for a long time. And I really wanted to go to Google I/O. This is like circa 2011, 2010. And because every year at Google I/O, Google comes out with the coolest technology on the entire planet, right? Like crazy new ideas, people skydiving into buildings. And I was like, I want to be at that event. But getting tickets, I sat in the lottery. I don't. Did anyone do the lottery, like the Google I/O lottery ever? Where you hit buy, and it just never works. But what I found out was that if you become a GDG organizer, a Google Developer Group organizer, you get a ticket to I/O. So I became a Google Developer Group organizer. So this is me back then. I used to wear Google Glass. I wore it for about 3 years. Happy to give an entire talk on that if you want. But what ended up happening was there became more and more of these GDGs around, and so they started saying only the lead organizer of a group gets Google I/O tickets. And so I heard, oh, but if you become a Google Developer Expert, then you get Google I/O tickets. So then I was a big fan of AngularJS back at the time, and so I became a Google Developer Expert for Angular. And that was really great. But then after doing that for about 2-3 years, and what I realized I was doing is I was actually volunteering a bunch of my time for one of the largest for-profit corporations in the world. So that wasn't maybe the smartest idea, so I decided to actually go and work there. So I went and joined the Angular team back in 2016. This is me still wearing my Google Glass like 3 years later. It was about 3 months after I joined Google that I stopped wearing Glass because Googlers actually don't like Glass. Like of all the critics of Google Glass that I've heard, most of them actually work at Google. If that tells you anything about that history. So I joined the Angular team. I started off leading developer relations. So if you attended NGConf, has anybody been to NGConf? Okay, one. Has anyone watched any of the videos from NGConf? Okay, so maybe you've seen my face before. Maybe? No? Okay, maybe it's been a few years. So I was at Google for about 5 years where I led the developer relations team, so I keynoted at NGConf, and I was a deep part of really trying to make Angular better and better every year. After about 5 years, I decided to leave, and I ended up joining the crypto industry, but I've stayed close to the Angular team. Like a bunch of the team members are still like my best friends in the world. Do video calls with them all the time, that sort of thing. So once I left Google, I became a GDE again. I grew, while I was at Google, I grew the GDE program from like 20 to around 120. So I created this entire interview process. I interviewed hundreds of people, brought them into the program, and then I left, and they're like, hey, let's do an interview. And it was like, okay, what are you going to ask me? Because I created this program, which was a little bit funny. But so I'm deeply connected to Angular, and one of the things that I've seen over the last few months and years is that the Angular team has really, really learned how to listen. And so they are doing a better and better job of figuring out what does the community want, where is the web going, and how do they get there to help everybody? So I'm an Angular GDE. I'm a DevRel lead, formerly in the Angular team. If you have questions about crypto, happy to answer anything about crypto. I used to be at Chainlink Labs, and now I'm at Axelar. So have a ton of insight and knowledge there. But this talk is about Angular, so I won't be touching crypto at all. Thank you. I'm sorry. You're welcome. So the whole premise of this talk is that Angular is evolving, right? This is not the same AngularJS that we had 6, 7, 8 years ago. Things keep getting different and better in a lot of different ways. And so one of the things that I always like to acknowledge is that being out of date in the web ecosystem really sucks. The web keeps evolving, but if you stay behind, you don't get new features, you don't get new performance benefits. And what we've noticed is that the best practices and the standards evolve over time. So as a web developer, you cannot stay static. You have to continue updating, you have to keep going. And even though we have things like NPM, which is theoretically immutable, right? Like all of the code all the way back from every version of Angular exists on NPM. Going back to those times is actually really hard. I've recently tried to go back to a Angular version 5 application and update it. And it's just kind of a pain because you have to get the right NPM version, you have to get the right TypeScript version. The tooling that we had 7, 8 years ago was not as good as the tooling we have today. And so part of this talk is an appeal to help everyone here know what's going on and then make good choices about how to stay up to date. One of the benefits for users, but also one of the problems that we see, is that ecosystems move slowly. So a lot of things I'm going to talk about in this talk are slow generational improvements, where we're going to see new capabilities. That doesn't mean the old capabilities are gone, But what we're seeing is that best practices are slowly moving. And so you kind of watch video tutorials slowly get updated over time. Consultancies start using these best practices. You're going to see blog posts get better. All these institutional knowledge that we have from all these teams that are building with Angular, it's going to continue evolving. And this talk is intended to be a part of that, is help everyone continue to evolve their Angular knowledge over time so that we're all building with the latest and greatest capabilities. I'm going to talk about timelines in this talk. I am not on the Angular team anymore, so do not take anything I say as representative or canonical in any way. These versions are my guesses based on what I've seen, what I've heard, but none of this, until software ships, nothing is certain. I think a lot of us have seen that in the past. So let's get in. The 5 topics I'm going to cover are standalone components, signals, SSR and pre-rendering, additional template syntax, and there's some very specific wording there, and then a couple of the smaller changes across Angular. And so we've got a couple people in the crowd that have not used Angular before. So the pitch I would give, or the explanation I would give for Angular is, it's an opinionated framework or platform for building web applications. And so if you are a React developer, you kind of have to cobble together all the different pieces that you want. I mean, I think Next has taken a huge leap forward in this in terms of React developer experience, but Angular tries to come with all those things out of the box in a single cohesive experience from a single team. And so the things we're going to see today are evolutions of Angular that make it better and easier to learn and more welcoming, hopefully, for newcomers. And if that's not the case, you can come up and you can tell me that later, and we can try and help the team fix that. So I'm going to start off with standalone components. How many people have written a standalone component before? OK. How many people have written an ng module before? All right, so for those of you in the know, Angular has historically been structured entirely around ng modules. It is an Angular concept of modules that organizes an application. It determines what services are available, what code dependencies are being pulled in, where your references and your templates are being resolved, all those sorts of things. But what's happened is ng modules have become more and more confusing over time for people, where it is a layer of complexity that a lot of teams don't want to deal with. They would rather work directly at the component layer, which is more similar to other frameworks and kind of this intuitive mental model of how components work. And so the Angular team has now made it possible to have standalone components. So this is in some ways a world where you don't need modules anymore. Obviously, again, this is a generational shift, and so modules are still completely supported. But the kind of new best practice that we're going to see people moving towards is using entirely sets of standalone components for basically everything in their application. And so if you wanted to look at an Angular component and see if it's standalone, you're going to notice this standalone true property in the component decorator. And then you're also going to notice this new imports property. So you've got things like ngIf, async pipe, router outlet. All these things are things you can import directly into your component, which determines the context that is used when compiling your HTML, your template. And then you can also do providers at the component level now too. All of that had to come from a service attached to an ng module before. But now, as soon as you set a component to be standalone, you can do that. You can do it all at the component level. You're also going to notice that you cannot, once a component is standalone, declare it as part of a module. So there is a fundamental separation where declarations coming from modules cannot be standalone components. So if you're living in the module part of the world, you can't have standalone components, but you can have standalone components separately. And the nice thing is there's perfect compatibility here. So if you are still living in an ng module world and you want to start moving into a component that is entirely standalone, you can import it as if it was another module. And vice versa, your component can import modules. So you have this dual compatibility where modules can import components, components can import modules, but each component is either one or the other. It is either a standalone component or it belongs exactly to one module. So one of the things that we saw with Angular modules was that it was really that base building block for the organization of applications. That you'd see this as part of lazy loading boundaries, you'd see this as part of shared services. This was how we built our application, right? I would have an app module, and then I would have a home module, and I would have an about module, and I have an admin module, and all these things would pull in all the code I need for each section of my site. And the way that I most often did this with lazy loading was this load children command, where you could basically import using a dynamic lazy loaded import to a module, and then it would resolve that module, attach the routes, et cetera. And then you saw the same thing with the services. So I would import a set of services, and then that would be available to my entire module. And so that was the way it world before. If you want to now think about this in the standalone component world, we use the router. So instead of having the module as the base building block, because our applications are almost always inherently built and structured via the router, you're now using the router for all that organization. So if we look at that same load children command, instead of importing a module from a file, you can actually just import the routes directly. So this is literally just a route specification that has references out to those components, and that can all be lazy loaded. And then you're also going to notice that you can add providers into a route. So I can say anything. So in this example, I've got a blank path that's pulling in the real-time data module. That path could be anything, right? I do this most often with my admin or my editing module. So whenever I'm building part of my application where there's richer interaction that's beyond just what a user is going to be doing, I'm going to use the router, and I'm going to apply those providers and pull in all that code that the editing interface needs that the view interface does not need. So one of the things that we did before is we would always kind of pull in whatever I might need. So I'd pull in the common module. I'd pull in all these sorts of things. What you're going to see now more often is you're pulling in exactly what you need. Because we have this very, very fine-grained resolution where every component can say, these are the things I exactly need. And because of Angular's build system, you can leave the rest out of the bundle size. You specify exactly what you need, and then nothing else is included, which helps reduce bundle size and increases or decreases the time to load of your application. There is a fantastic guide for how to do this if you like written form, angular.io/guide/standalone components. I'm just going to give you the barest of demos and overviews of kind of how to do this yourself. So the tool that you're going to use is Angular schematics. So this is the same thing that we apply with ng-add. This is the same thing that we apply with ng-update, where you're going to say ng-generate, and we've got a package in, there's a generator within Angular core called Standalone. And you're going to run that command, and it's going to give you 3 options. Number 1, convert all components, directives, and pipes to standalone. Number 2, remove unnecessary modules. And 3, bootstrap the application using standalone APIs. And so effectively what the guide tells you to do is run this command, select the first option, fix it up, run this command, select the second option, fix it up, run the third command, select this option, fix it up. And so the way that I think about this kind of generator is it's both a finely tuned, amazing tool, as we'll see in a moment. Like it's very nuanced, it's very intelligent and capable. But at the same time, it feels a little bit like a bludgeoning stick, where you just kind of keep hitting it until your application works. And so if brute force doesn't work, you're just not using enough. I think this is always good advice. But we're going to do a brief demo and actually look at what it looks like to convert an application over into standalone modules. Does this microphone work? Can you hear me? All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive over into an application. So as I said, I was a DevFest organizer, so we actually have a DevFest website for an upcoming DevFest. If you like Minnesota in December, we have DevFest Minnesota. So if you like snow, you like this really strong association with Christmas. I mean, Chicago's almost the same. Although it's 77 here today, and it was like 42 in Minnesota. So I don't know, there's a bit of a comparison. So this is a standard Angular application right now, and it is not using standalone components. So if we take a look at the source code here, you're going to see app components, you're going to see modules, all these sorts of things in the traditional way, as per the application that I built 6, 7, 8 years ago. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the terminal here. We're going to kill that project that we're not actually demoing right now. We'll cd in here and we'll say ng-update. ng-generate. Here we go. ng-generate Angular core standalone. So we're going to call that command. It's going to ask us which type of update do we want to do. We're going to pick the first one, convert all components, and which path should be migrated. So I'll just pick the default, which is my entire project. You can see how because you can mix modules and components, you could kind of mix that up. And you'll notice it modified almost every component, or it did modify every single component of my application. So if we look at the Git history, you can see 43 different changes to my application. All of these are just turning every component into standalone, fixing the imports based on what's actually used in the template. So it's smart enough to see what's in my template and then apply the right components. And then you'll notice that the module has had all of the declarations removed, and they are now imports. So that was basically it. So now I have an application that is fully built on standalone components, or at least it looks like it's built on standalone components because every component is now standalone. But you'll notice that if we, for example, look in our app module, our app module is still handling the routing. So we are still using an ng module to handle routing. And so if we follow that kind of bludgeoning path where we now, we've done this first update, we can do the second one. We can migrate the whole thing. It's going to say nothing to be done. So we actually are using these ng modules, so it cannot remove them cleanly yet. And so what we can do is we can go ahead and fix that. And so the only thing I really have to fix is this routing. And I'm not going to do everything right now. I'm going to go ahead and do the third step. I will change our bootstrap away from using a component to bootstrap the application, and now I'm going to, away from using a module to bootstrap the application, and now I'm going to use a component. So if we look at our main.ts, and let's look at it in the changelog here, you'll notice it is no longer using Platform Browser Dynamic. It is just bootstrapping the application with a reference to the app component. And so I think this fails, so let's just try it real quick. Let's take a look at our application. Yep, URL is declared here. We've got a problem. And so what I can do is, it didn't do it perfectly. I actually have to do this. I have to say URL goes to this code. So this is an example of where it didn't do a perfect transform from what I wanted into what I needed. But one change for like 47 files is not too bad at all. And if we just refresh the application here, we should notice that it keeps working. While that's running, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into our app module. And I want to show you how it looks to convert some of that lazy loading. Where is it here? Sorry, I've lost code here. All right, our application is working here. We've got lazy loading across component boundaries. Perfect. So we're going to find our content module. We're going to find the references to our content module. There we go, main.ts. So that routing configuration has been pulled out of the ng module now that we changed our bootstrap of our application, and it's here. But you'll notice we're still trying to load those content modules for the kind of subsidiary routing. And so what I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and show you really quickly how to change that. So I'm going to pull up our content module. So I'm not going to update the entire application. I'm just going to do this. And so instead of exporting an ng module, all I really need is these routes. So I can say export routes equals, and then everything else is gone. And if I've matched up export const. All right, there we go. So now we have a routes configuration in our content.module, but this isn't really even a module anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this file into content.routes. And if we are doing things correctly, our VS Code should have updated for us. Yep, content.routes here, so it's changed the import. And then all I have to do here is say routes. If you export that as the default instead of exporting it as a const, you don't even need the then. Angular router will notice that this is a thenable, and then it will just automatically load those lazily. And so if we take a look now at our application, it's been rebuilt. And if we pull open the Source Explorer, not that one. We will notice when we go to, for example, our, if we just refresh and go to our sponsor route, that is one of the content routes. And now instead of loading a module, it's loading that routes, and it's loading all those components, right? So it looks very similar, but now we're using the routing infrastructure as the entire thing that our app is hanging off of. Does that make sense? OK. So demo number 1 successful. If you are interested in standalone components, they were introduced actually in V14 as developer preview. So this is something they've been working on for quite some time now, as this is one of the kind of bigger changes. Again, ng modules are still there, but they are kind of now optional. You can opt out and you can go for standalone. And in V16, they became just like a normal feature. They came out of preview. And one of the things that if you take a look at the V17 defaults, so if you create a new project with V17, which 6 days ago went into RC, so V17 is very, very nearing final. I think their target date is in November. It is using standalone components by default. So Bootstrap or Platform Browser Dynamic is likely no more. ng modules are not really the best practice anymore going forward. Standalone components is the direction that the Angular team is pushing the community in. All right, so that was standalone components. Now we're going to go a little bit into signals. So in my mind, signals is really the future of reactivity in Angular. So there are lots of libraries out there, NGRX, RxJS, all these sorts of things. All of those things will still work perfectly fine. But as a primitive, they bring a lot of complexity. They bring a lot of information. So what's funny about this is back when I was on the Angular team, we did a lot of surveying. We talked to a lot of developers. And we said, well, what do you think of RxJS? And about half of the developers said, we want less RxJS. It's too complicated. And the other half were like, we need more RxJS. We want RxJS everywhere. And so what the Angular team did is they did a bunch of research. They figured out, OK, here is a minimal API that we can implement that is compatible with all those other solutions, but that solves this fundamental problem within Angular of performant change detection that is content aware. How many people want more RxJS in their applications? Nobody. How many people want less RxJS in their applications? Okay. So hopefully you're happy here. So one of the principles here is reactivity everywhere, not just components. So you don't have to just do like on push and then have the component update everything. You can have data that lives anywhere in your application in a service and it will automatically be detected when it gets bound. You can do much more precise updates, so we can like update less of the application if everything is based on a reactive primitive like signals. And the signals library itself is about 2K. And part of the vision there is that like, once you have this reactive primitive, you don't need things like zones. So we don't have to monkey patch every single API in the browser. We can just say, hey, here's an object with an update method, and whenever you call update, we are going to know that that thing is dirty, and we're going to be able to trigger change detection. Creating a signal is really, really easy. I think we've got a few people here that are already starting to use signals. So you have this signal function, and you give it an initial value. In many ways, a signal is very much like a behavior subject, if you know RxJS at all, where it has a single value at any given time, and anyone can access that, and it can be shared and things like that. And so if you wanted to log out the value, like every signal is kind of, it has an accessor, just call the function. So you can say, check the count is what. And then you can increment that by calling the update method. So the update method is a function, takes it a value, returns a modification of that value. And then you can do things that, you can create what's called a computed. So this is another type of signal. It's actually just a signal itself. But this signal knows that it is computed based on the value of another signal. So double count is now going to be a signal that is count times 2. And so whenever count is updated, double count will also be updated. And so you can kind of follow this dependency tree of state updates across an entire application without the complexity of an RxJS type system or NGRX, et cetera. You can directly use them in templates. This is a bit surprising to some people because who've been told never call a function in your templates ever, ever, ever. But now you want to call the function of a signal in order to check its value. And what this does is basically, if you turn all of your components to on push, whenever a template updates, a template has a binding to a signal, and that signal updates, the template is then notified and can re-render the template. And you can do it instead of like in Angular normally with on push, when a component is updated, you have to update all of its children. But with signals, we actually have very, very fine-tuned precision, where you can actually update a single component in the tree and not have to update all of its children because you know exactly which templates are affected. So it's an even finer-grained level of control and improvement to the performance of change detection via signals. There's also an equivalent of effects, if anybody's ever used effects. So if you want something to happen whenever a value changes, you can do the exact same thing. So you take in, create a new effect, and then that effect is going to rely on a signal, and then whenever that signal updates, it'll automatically call that effect. Yeah, the good thing here is that signals are very backwards compatible. Like we talked about how we're converting all of our components over to standalone components with the signals kind of API. You don't have to think about rebuilding your entire application, right? You can do it one object at a time, one variable at a time, giving you those new reactive primitives, giving you those new performance benefits. And there's built-in methods and signals for interoperability with RxJS. You can like get a signal from an RxJS object, from an observable, all those sorts of things. And so compatibility with the existing reactive ecosystem is critical. Signals was developer preview in v16, expected to be stable in v17, so that's coming out about next month. And then what I call superpowers in v18 and beyond. So this was the timeline, so just v15, v16. When I say superpowers, I mean things like support for inputs, outputs, queries, all being signals themselves. So that you get these kind of native primitives. So you could say, give me this property as a signal, and then it'll automatically be able to be bind through my template, and then I don't have to involve any RxJS. I don't have to like call ng on changes ever again. I can just do everything directly on that object. And then also, theoretically, at some point in the future, fully zoneless applications, where when we have this reactive primitive, you don't now need to be checking all of the monkey patch async events in the browser. We just will trust you to tell us when it's an asynchronous event has been resolved. So again, all of this is like very long ways out. The Angular team has this thing that I always talked about called the kind of the breaking budget, which is how much can we shift everyone here's mental model of Angular in a single year. And so the team spends a lot of time trying to make sure that no one gets left behind. So if you ever feel left behind, you should file an issue and complain and say like, hey, this is too complicated, because that voice is critical to the team. Like they deeply care about making you successful. All right, the third big feature I'm going to be talking about is server-side rendering and pre-rendering. So Angular has had server-side rendering for quite some time, right? It was Angular Universal. It existed. It's a way of taking your Angular application and running it within Node, within a JavaScript execution environment, to get out this string that represents your Angular application. So that has existed, but they're spending a lot of time and energy right now improving those APIs and then adding on things like pre-rendering hydration. So quick definition, server-side rendering is when you do that, you take an Angular application and you give it some state, and then you get out a string of what the HTML should look like so that you can cache that on a server, serve it in real time, whatever that means to you. Pre-rendering is when you do this kind of at build time rather than at request time. So I'm personally a big fan of pre-rendering for like blog applications, things like that, where the content should be ready, it shouldn't be variable, it just needs to be like stored on a CDN and then served as fast as possible. And then the last piece is all about hydration, which is how do you take these HTML that you've sent to the browser and enrich it with the functionality that comes from Angular. So historically, the hydration technique has been no hydration, which means if you pre-rendered before, used Angular Universal before, we would take that entire HTML set, delete it, and create brand new nodes. And so from a web performance standpoint, what Chrome reports, et cetera, this was very bad, right? Because effectively you're rendering an entire application and then tearing down that entire DOM, building it back up, and then re-rendering that. And so you'd have like this tearing that would happen where you'd have just blank frames and things like that based on how complicated your application was. But now we have we have hydration. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons to use SSR, performance, accessibility. If you're trying to get indexed by crawlers like the Google search engine, Google can render Angular content, but it also renders static HTML content faster, and there's like different crawlers that can detect content faster. Things like Twitter bots, Facebook, social bots, none of them can run JavaScript, and so you need this static HTML, you need this server-side and pre-rendered content. And anytime a user gets an experience faster, they're going to end up being happier. So you take, effectively before we would just blow away the entire HTML of your application and rebuild it, but now all of those things just get all the events wired up to them, and then the application kind of continues on from there. It's crazy simple to install hydration into any sort of server-side rendered application. All you have to do is provide client hydration. You just provide that single provider as part of your Bootstrap application, and it's done. Effectively, what's going to happen is Angular Universal is going to add these like little comments and markers in your HTML so that it knows where those components are, and then it can kind of bootstrap them, attach the LD events, et cetera, so that we don't have to recreate any of the HTML. In V16, hydration was developer preview, and I'm expecting in V17 for that to be stable. All right, now this one, I chose this wording very carefully because some people have been calling it a new template syntax, which to me means like throw away everything you know. But this is in some way, it's in almost every way, it's an additional template syntax. So now the Angular team is trying to give you new primitives within the template syntax that lets you do cool things that you couldn't do before. So, and the first one is all about lazy loading. So how many people are doing lazy loading of anything? Like, hey, let's not load our entire application and make it faster. If you wanted to make that recommended movies component a lazy loaded component, you would have to do a lot of work, right? Because what if you want to show a status page, right? What if it's going to take 2 seconds to load? Like, you can't just make a user wait 2 seconds or 10 seconds. So you have to show that, hey, loading bar. What if it fails to load? What do? You have to figure out that. When do you want to load it? Like, are you just loading it eagerly as soon as the page loads, or are you going to trigger based on some user interaction, maybe a hover event or whatever? And then how are you going to get into the existing componentry and like swap out the things? You're going to need view children, view child refs, all these sorts of things. So lazy loading at the component level based on user behavior has been very, very hard historically in Angular. But now there's a solution. So let's take this component, our recommended movies component, or excuse me, our movie details component, which is pulling in this recommended movies. And now we have a defer command. So @defer, and then I put in any of the HTML that I want in that, and then that will be loaded when it as a lazy layer. You have to be a little bit careful about defer because if you have like a bunch of components and every component's deferring, you can create a waterfall where instead of loading the application all at once and being fast, it loads something and then goes to the internet, and then loads and then goes to the internet, and loads and goes to the internet. But this is the primitive that makes it very, very easy. Built on top of this, there's a whole bunch of different things that can automatically handle different capabilities you want. So you can say, here's the UI I want to show when it's loading. Here's the UI I want to show when it errors. And then you can also start customizing these things. So you can say, I want to defer and then load it when the target is in the viewport. Right? This is probably the most common thing, is like, why am I spending all these cycles, all this network, all this CPU on components that aren't even seen? And so this, if you put it on viewport, then it's going to defer until it's within the viewport. And you can do much fancier things. Like you can say, hey, let's prefetch on idle. So when the CPU is not busy, let's go ahead and prefetch all the other blocks that we might need in the future. And so there's it kind of gets more and more fancy. So here's an example where we're creating a target tag. So we're naming the template, the div. And then you can say, hey, when this viewport is visible, then prefetch on idle. There's a whole bunch of these different defer block capabilities. So we've got defer, loading, error, and placeholder. And then there's triggers. So you can do it on idle. You can say immediately go get it. You can say on a timer. So hey, let's wait till it's 5 seconds. The page has been loaded for 30 seconds and then go load all this. On viewport, on interaction, on hover. And you can kind of combine these things. So here's one where we've got a counter that is built into a button. And then when that count is 5 and we've had 5 seconds pass, then we're lazy loading that. Right? So you can see how all these different pieces can compose into very capable APIs. The other new or additional template syntax with that @ sign notation also comes from control flow. So the one that I think a lot of us have seen is when you want to do a conditional template, you have ngIf, and you put it on the item itself, and then you have to have a template tag on the else statement. So what they've done is they've made it much, much simpler. So all you have to do is say @if, you give it a condition, you give it the template that you want, and then you can say @else, and you can combine else ifs and else, and kind of go from there. And so this is a much simpler syntax for specifying that content. And it does go a little bit further than that. And so I wanted to just give you a short preview of what that looks like. And so here is a set of templates. So we've got if show, we're showing now versus we're hiding now. And you can toggle that with a button. I've got a for loop, so for item of data. We can do track by here. And so we've got a div for each of those items. And then we have a switch statement. So based on your choice, we can render a template, and then there can be a default template. And so do you guys want to see this served, or should we just keep moving? Yes, okay, we got 1 vote for serving it. So we're going to do it. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to that V17. So again, this is only available in V17 as part of the developer preview. We'll hit yarn start. Actually, let's hit yarn start -O. It's going to say 4200's busy. We are not in the right folder. All right, here we go. So we're hiding now, so you can toggle. We're showing now, so you've got that toggle per our template. And then you've got that ng4 showing out this array, which were just very simple numbers. And then when I click on them, that switch statement is activating. So again, this is a template syntax that just tries to make the template layout much, much simpler. You've got control flow now, and then you've got this built-in defer. This syntax, it's developer preview in V17. So it's there right now. V17 is in RC, so you can go try it out. You saw that demo. You can also combine them. I don't know where I put that slide. We'll come back to it when we find it. But there's also been a huge number of smaller changes across Angular. And so I'm just going to call out some of these really quickly. Vite is a very, very popular serving environment. I'll call it Vite. Vite is many different things, but effectively Angular now takes advantage of ESBuild and Vite. So we have this really, really fast development environment, as well as kind of a more universal build system, rather than the more custom stack that they had before. Stack traces have been improved, so this might look familiar if you've ever debugged Angular application. So they've tried to make it much more relevant, so showing you exactly what you need, hiding the other errors. They're trying to make it a little bit more linked. So you'll see instead of just a reference to app.component with like app component click listener, you'll actually see a reference to the template part that had that problem. And then really making it friendly. So trying to explain what's going on here rather than just throwing errors. So this is going to be huge. I think it's going to make a lot of Angular developers very happy. One of the other big wins that I think a lot of developers are excited about are what called host directives. So a directive in Angular is where you you can attach functionality onto any component or any HTML tag. I actually do this. I create a directive for my A tags, and I automatically check if the href of the A tag is external, and if it's external, I make it no refer, no opener. And so like I just created that A tag, and so now what you can do is you can programmatically apply a host directive to a component. So you can just say, this component should have this host. You don't actually need to have it in the template anymore because there's no way to bind to the parent, to the host element previously. But now we have host directives, and so you can say, hey, anything of this component should also have this directive applied, which is a very, very nice capability. There are brand new design tokens in Google Material 3 that have been manifested in the Angular Material Library. I am not the right person to talk about design tokens, but if you care about design tokens, take a look at this QR code or this URL. Basically, it's the ability to configure more globally the theming of your application. And there's been a lot of improvements to that coming in V17 and beyond across the Angular Material components. So we've talked about standalone components, we talked about signals, SSR prerendering, template syntax, and a lot of these minor features. The way that I would summarize that is really Angular is easier than ever, and everything continues to get better, right? Like, they haven't taken away your toys. All of your toys are still there. You can still use ng modules. You can still rely on Zone. But they're trying to build this evolution of Angular that makes everything that you do simpler on a day-to-day basis, easier for new teams to ramp up on, and just easier to reason about, kind of more logic and more consistent with the web ecosystem as it is today. And I believe the future is really bright. So if you have any feedback on this talk, I would love to hear it. That's what the QR code and that survey is. I definitely appreciate all the sorts of feedback because I want to continue making these talks better. But thank you, everyone, for coming.